Hello, my name is Omar Rampersad. It's Sunday, April 14, 2019 at 1:59 p.m. in Toronto. I posted a bunch of links to a study or a review that was done on the Paul Bernardo's case on my Twitter account, ROSHINI 911. And I posted the link in several of my tweets. And I'm going to read some of the contents of the review that I thought should be emphasized. So it's dated June 1996, the review. Bernardo's investigation review summary. And the report was done by Mr. Justice Archie Campbell. I'm just going to pick parts of this review. You can read the 32-page report with the link I provided. To introduce the review, it says between May of 1987 and December of 1992, Paul Bernardo raped or sexually assaulted at least 18 women in Scarborough, that's the area in which I live, Peel, that's the area in which my sister lives, and St. Catharines, that's near the Niagara Falls area, and killed 3 women in St. Catharines and Burlington. So those 2 cities are close by. Paul Bernardo is a unique type of criminal, a determined, organized, mobile, sadistic, serial rapist and killer who demonstrates the ability of such predators to strike in any Ontario community. The tragic history of this case and similar cases from other countries shows that these predators pose a unique challenge to the systemic investigative capacity of local law enforcement agencies throughout North America and Europe. The Bernardo case proves that the Bernardo case proves that Ontario is no exception. This is a review of the work done by local and provincial law enforcement and forensic agencies during the Bernardo investigations. The Bernardo case, like every similar investigation, had its share of human error. But this is not a story of human error or lack of dedication or investigative skill. It is a story of systemic failure. It is easy, knowing now that Bernardo was a rapist and a killer, to ask why he was not identified earlier for what he was. But the same question and the same problems have arisen in so many other similar tragedies in other countries. Virtually every interjurisdictional serial killer case, including Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, the cross-border child killer in England, Ted Bundy, and the Green River Killer in the United States, and Clifford Olson in Canada, demonstrates the same problems and raise the same questions. And always the answer turns out to be the same: systemic failure. Always the problem turns out to be the same, the mistakes the same, and the systemic failures the same. And that's a very key point there. The systemic failures throughout the world is the same. What is needed is a system of case management for major and interjurisdictional serial predator investigations, a system that corrects the defects demonstrated by this and so many similar cases. A case management system is needed that is based on cooperation rather than rivalry among law enforcement agencies. A case management system is needed that depends on specialized training, early recognition of linked offenses, coordination of interdisciplinary and forensic resources, and some simple mechanisms to ensure unified management, accountability, and coordination when serial predators cross police borders. There are times during the separate investigations of the Scarborough rapes and the St. Catherine rapes and murders that the different police forces might as well have been operating in different countries. Now, my comment there is Paul Bernardo was known and in the area of Scarborough because 18 rapes reported. And of course, every policeman in these divisions would have known about it and it would have been public information. So these cities are very close by. They're not different countries. They're within 100 kilometers of the city of Toronto. So it's not as if they were in different countries. And news, of course, travels. So it's hard for me to understand why the police, of all people who would know what's going on and what's been reported and the crimes that's been investigated, would not, if not formally communicate, would not informally communicate information that will help the investigation along. I don't understand that. So, okay, so I think I made my point there. So let me just skip through. So they talked about falling through the cracks, how some information was not used the way it should. They had the information, but it just was not put together. The pieces of the puzzle was not put together. So one of the paragraphs here is some of the systemic weaknesses have been identified and corrected in Ontario through changes in investigative procedures and advances in the application of forensic science. There must be a public recognition, and I'm skipping through here, there must be a public recognition that these problems are not just problems for the police and law enforcement communities. These are problems for the community as a whole. A commitment to correct them is necessary in order to guard against another case like this. So the first chapter in the body of the review, that was an introduction. The summary. So this is an introduction. The Bernardo case, like every similar investigation, had its share of human error. But this is not a story of human error or lack of dedication or investigative skill. It is a story of systemic failure. And they repeated that there. So there's a lot of repetition in this. Maybe it's maybe it was intentional, I'm not sure. The Bernardo case shows that motivation, investigative skill, and dedication are not enough. The work of the most dedicated, skillful, and highly motivated investigators and supervisors and forensic scientists can be defeated by the lack of effective case management systems and the lack of systems to ensure communication and cooperation among law enforcement agencies. And I'm skipping through chapter 2. There was no lack of hard work, dedication, and investigative skill by individual officers. The investigative strategies were sound, but the investigation was hampered by systemic weaknesses. There was no single person in charge. There was no single person in charge at the beginning, and until Superintendent Wolf took over, there was very little continuity of investigators. Conspicuous by its absence, repeat, conspicuous by its absence was any system whereby senior officers, repeat, senior officers monitored and followed up the investigation and set timelines and ensured follow-up. Although the DNA submission went into a black hole, no alarm bells went off, even when it was returned untested by the CFS, that's the lab, because there was no monitoring or supervisory system in place to ensure follow-up with the CFS and high-level coordination when necessary. So Bernardo was shortlisted, 5 of 100 plus, and there was further testing that was needed a second time. That was not submitted, or it was submitted and it was left on a shelf for 2 years. There was no follow-up from the officers who submitted it. There was no information system to ensure that all the tips called in about one suspect were put together and followed up when appropriate. The McNiff report was ignored for over 2.5 years. It is discouraging that a report from an experienced officer should disappear into a hole like that, another black hole. Even after other tips about Bernardo started to come in, they were not put together. They were scattered throughout the files and index books and binders and desk drawers in a paper-driven process described by one investigator as a nightmare. The final SIMIS tip, SMIMIS, don't think I pronounced that right, about Bernardo, the third unrelated tip about the same suspect was only followed up because of the persistence of the caller, because there was no system to show immediately that it was the third separate tip about the same suspect. There was no consistent organized system for suspect classification and elimination. The problems that arose from the lack of a case management system show that motivation, investigative skill, and dedication are not enough. The work of the most dedicated, skillful, and highly motivated investigators and supervisors can be defeated by the lack of an effective case management system. Communication between police forces were inadequate. There was at that time no VIC-LAS automated crime linkage system in place. There was not even any system to ensure, and I imagine that's the name of the system. I'm not sure what it stands for. There was not even any system to ensure that the zone alert from the Henley Island rape was considered by the Metro investigators, that's Toronto, a zone alert that would have suggested strongly to any experienced investigator that the Scarborough rapist was operating in St. Catharines. So there was no alert, cross-jurisdictional alert. That's my comment. The chase of a suspect from a stakeout on May 25, 1988, now believed to be Bernardo, and the rape by Bernardo 4 days later in Mississauga, suggests that serial predators will move their base of operation to avoid a tightening police cordon. When the Scarborough rape stopped, the investigation wound down, and Metro Toronto put it on the back burner because of compelling workload from other recent sexual assaults. So there's a whole lot of other assaults. There were no provincial system in place to recognize that serial predators are mobile, and to ensure that the investigation was continued vigorously after the local police force no longer considers it a priority. Rape is not a priority. Ongoing rape. There was no system in place that's my comment. There was no system in place to recognize a wider public interest in tracking down the predator, wider than the interest of Metro taxpayers, but just as high in priority for the residents of other communities at risk from a mobile serial predator. In other words, it's not my jurisdiction, I don't care. He's not in Toronto anymore. When Bernardo stopped stalking and raping in Toronto and started stalking and raping and killing in St. Catharines and Burlington, he might as well have moved to another country for a fresh start. This is the attitude of this is the attitude. It's not my jurisdiction, it's yours. The center, chapter 3, the Center of Forensic Sciences, and I skipped quite a bit there. I'm just picking up what I in my opinion, is points, valid points that to make my point. Not that the rest is not valid. It's just highlighting certain points. So Bernardo's samples were submitted to CFS, the lab, on November 21st, 1990 for conventional serology testing, and if the serology was right, for DNA testing. The serology results on December 13, 1990 showed that his serology was right for DNA testing. Thus, December 13, 1990, the CFS had a written request from Metro to test Bernardo's sample for DNA. So I'd imagine it was the same sample. It was already in the lab, and the first test was run, came back positive, and the second test was requested. 2 years later, it was not done. Despite this request for DNA testing effective December 13, 1990, Bernardo's test results were not obtained until February 1st, 1993. It appears that Bernardo's DNA submission went into a black hole at the end of 1990. The overall delay between December 13, 1990 and February 1st, 1993 was over 25 and a half months. If the 5 suspect samples, including Bernardo's, had been given the highest priority on December 13, 1990, the DNA match to Bernardo could have been found in early January 1991. The CFS test of Bernardo's DNA sample on February 1st, 1993 led to his arrest and prevented him from raping or killing again. The tragic converse of this fact is that Bernardo, during the 25 and a half months his DNA was waiting to be tested, raped 4 young women and raped, tortured, and murdered 2 others. And let's assume here my comment that this is what was found. It's possible that there were more. In hindsight, it is clear that these rapes and murders could have been prevented if Bernardo's DNA sample had been tested by the CFS within 30 or even 90 days of December 13th, 1990 serology test. The underlying reason for the delay was a limited capacity of the DNA lab during its startup period to conduct the labor-intensive and time-consuming RFLP DNA test in a timely fashion in the face of a heavy workload. 2 years this is not for me. This is not a good enough excuse. This was compounded by the lack of any supervisory system within the Metro Police Department to ensure that the case was monitored and followed up. And that's what the problem was. There was no following up. It was followed up vigorously at a higher level. Let me say that again. This was compounded by the lack of any supervisory system within the Metro Police Department to ensure that the case was monitored and followed up vigorously at a higher level, and by communication problems between the CFS and the Metropolitan Toronto Police within the CFS itself. At the heart of the tragedy was a systemic failure. In my opinion, it's more than systemic. There's something more. There was no system to recognize that a Scarborough rapist was going to kill someone and to give the case a high level of coordination among all agencies involved in the investigation. For Metro and the CFS, it was business as usual. That to me doesn't make sense. The people working on the case had no mandate or direction to set everything else aside and stop the Scarborough rapist before he killed someone. After he stopped raping in Toronto, he naturally became a lower priority in Toronto. There was no system to recognize that a serial predator like Bernardo is not just a problem for Toronto, but also for every other community he may move to when things got too hot for him at home. There was no system to recognize a wider public interest in the apprehension of a serial sexual predator beyond the parochial interests of one particular community. Again, it's not my jurisdiction, it's yours. It was known that serial predators don't usually stop until they're dead or in jail. It is known. Yet there was no system in place to drive this case forward to the top of the priority list or to leapfrog it ahead of other serial sexual assaults and murder cases. There was no case management system in the Metro Force to supervise this cold case and drive it forward vigorously. There was no strategic coordination of the work of the different agencies involved in the investigation. No one assumed the responsibility to push Bernardo's DNA test ahead because there was no system, because there was no system to prioritize and urgently drive forward the investigation of this violent, escalating mobile serial predator. And I'm skipping ahead here. Most importantly, the Bernardo case demonstrates that delay in DNA testing can imperil personal safety and cost lives. Any reluctance to continue to spend the public funds necessary to maintain a reasonable turnaround time for DNA testing must give way to a consideration of the financial and human cost of failing to do so. So the lab needed more money is what they were saying. Which is probably one of the factors, but not a good enough reason. And some other failures, quote unquote, in the investigation. The secret killing of Tammy Homolka, that's the Homolka's sister. It was inappropriate for the coroner, Dr. Roslowski, to submit a final report showing death by natural causes when there was a dramatic and unexplained second-degree burn over much of Tammy's face. Inappropriate to report that she died by means of natural causes when she did not know how she died, when he did not know how she died. And inappropriate to list asthma as a cause of death when he had no evidence that asthma caused or contributed in any way to her death. Yet another inconsistency. I cannot say that there was any breach of duty by the NRPS, that's the Niagara Region officers. It is clear, however, that there was bad communication between Weeks and Mitchell, and Weeks did not communicate all his suspicions to Mitchell. It is also clear that there was a major discrepancy between the 15 and 20-minute wait before the 911 call that Bernardo described to the ambulance drivers in the 2 to 3 minute wait he described to Mitchell. A major discrepancy that Mitchell did not investigate, although he knew there were suspicions about the delay. He accepted Bernardo's explanation of the discrepancy too easily, without checking readily available sources of highly credible information that would have starkly contradicted Bernardo. Had Weeks' private suspicions or Bernardo's contradiction about the 911 call been followed up, there would have been further questioning of Bernardo and Homolka, although it is speculative to suggest that further questions of them would have led to the truth. Well, nobody knows. The question of the unexplained burn, although it was picked up by Dr. Groves and referred to by Dr. Hillsdon Smith, was left hanging without any resolution, and there was apparently no follow-up with the dermatopathologist. Don't think I pronounced that right either, although that was raised as a possibility by Dr. Hillsdon Smith. The work of the pathologists on the burn was done in apparent isolation from the coroners and other investigators, and without any attempt at a collaborative or team or interdisciplinary approach. It appears that the role of the pathologists was somewhat isolated and certainly not fully integrated into the death investigation system. This may have accounted in part for the lack of follow-up in respect to the burn and the fact that the case was closed without any explanation for the burn. So there was a lot of inconsistencies. And I can go on. Actually, I'll read a little bit more. Wow, it's been 25 minutes. Um, so I'll have to read the rest in another video. We'll have to cut it off there.